Welcome to the Furries Get Red Pilled podcast. Today we are actually having a very special episode. We are discussing post-work theory as it pertains to the next couple chapters that we will be covering in the Bread Book. I am today's host, Phelan Gecko, the United Anarchist of the group. Unfortunately, I am taking over for Khan because he is in Europe right now. Having a little bit of vacation. So who's everybody else that's here today? Are we all here? Are we alive? Are we breathing?
I breathe fire. So I'm Zulakath. I'm just I guess an egoist anarchist.
Hello, I'm Cardin, and I'm a tranarchist. I know I'm left-leaning as hell pro-labor, but that's gonna render out a little more gradually. I decided I'm not gonna act like I've got the answer to it quite yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, so to kind of give us a brief introduction, we're actually doing post-work theory today, as outlined by Jacob and Mag. They had a little article back in 2013 about it, and we'll do a little bit of highlights from David Frayne and his refusal of work, the theory and practice of resistance to work. This is going to be a little bit of a more casual episode than the previous ones. Mostly because it's just kind of going into what it means to.
I'll be real, we're doing filler this time. This is totally filler.
Though we chose this topic mostly because it is directly pertaining to the next three chapters labeled food, shelter, and clothing, if I'm not mistaken, in the Bread Book, which is what the next episode will
be. Are we
be.
really calling it the Bread Book?
It is the Bread Book.
It's always been called the Bread Book.
Wait, people have been calling... How many parties have I been missing out on with this shit?
Anyways, I think Zulakath has a little bit of a detail about what work is and how the post-work theorists describe work.
I don't know about detail. I mean, it's a little bit vague just at the outset, and they do spend some time trying to explain what they mean by it. But, I mean, if it's anti-work, you have to understand what work even is, because... the way they use it, work doesn't mean labor. They're not anti-labor, they're anti-work. And that's a bit of a fuzzy distinction.
Well, yeah, because you have three types of labor: productive labor, reproductive labor, and sex work. Well, emotional labor, I guess, is the more broad variant of that form of labor.
Oh, no, I think you can break it down a lot of different ways. That's one way to do it.
Basically, the idea of work is not necessarily the labor instilled in farming and generating clothes, building houses and things like that, but a very specific form of labor that a lot of people in the recent era have actually described as useless work.
Or bullshit jobs. I like that one. Yeah, I don't think there's like a very precise consensus in post-work theory about what work is. I think there's like room for a diversity of opinion there, and room for different analyses to say different things about it. When I was reading the Bob Black article on it, he was basically saying that it's just, if you're not playing when you're being productive, then it's work, is one way to kind of summarize what he was saying about it.
And I don't work because I fucking love this commission shit.
Yeah. Our artistic labor is definitely not something that people simply do for the money. They often do it as an emotional thing. And I think the biggest part of bullshit jobs would be middle management. The managers of the managers that report to other managers.
Well, it's a weird thing with that whole middle management thing, because in order to mitigate that fact, and not even mitigate the fact itself, but mitigate people pointing out that fact, they've essentially resorted to having the managers every so often pop into the store to do some, real work, as it were.
Yeah, basically contributing productively to kind of be like, oh yeah, I do work too.
Yeah, but it's really obvious that they're only doing it for the sake of being able to say, well, I get this done too.
One of the biggest things that I've noticed that is the culprit of is regional directors, people who are like, they're managers of stores, of multiple stores, but all they really do is come in and be like, hey, is everything running smoothly? Oh, well, here's a couple ideas to help it run a little smoother. And when they're there, and especially at one of my jobs, the regional directors, they don't really do work. They kind of just oh, this needs to get done. You need to get this done. And they kind of, in a sense, they're throwing a wrench into the system, thinking they're fixing it.
God, I hate that.
When in fact, the major thing that they're doing is, making things worse by thinking they're making it better. And when they're writing reports to their managers, because of course they have managers all the way up to the CEOs of these companies, especially for multinational companies.
Yeah, there is actually this funny thing about hierarchy is that information that flows up the hierarchy gets corrupted by each individual in the hierarchy trying to be self-serving, and the commands that come down from the top are corrupted by people who know better because they gave the bad information to the people above them. So the actual leadership or whoever's in charge of the organization can live in a world of complete fiction.
And almost demand to do so because they want the profits, but none of the consequences to flow upstairs.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually saw this recently at one of my other jobs where we had been severely understaffed for months, and it wasn't until the CEO and the vice president of the company had actually come into the store and actually observed what was happening that they were like, oh, no, that this can't be okay. We have to change this.
It's there's those sort of things that happened at my first job was gas station customer service representative, CSR, and we were doing pretty good with the pumps. With we implemented a new policy that avoided more drive-offs with our gas. And regional manager comes in and is like, oh, hey, so your drive-off numbers are down, so I guess we're just going to relax it and make all the pumps pump and pay. And I remember, raising my hand in that meeting, and I was like, Kara Thrace, that's a stupid fracking idea. And he's like, why? He's like, we're going to have drive-offs like crazy now. He's like, no, you're not. A month goes by and we've had twice as many drive-offs as before we made the adjustment. And he comes in, he puts in a meeting and he's mad. He wants to know, why we got so many drive-offs? I'm sitting here, well, you hardly fucking work here, so you probably wouldn't understand why we have drive-offs in those rear pumps. But you just demanded that we open the door and then walked away expecting everything to be fine.
Expecting everybody else to take responsibility for it, too. What a scumbag.
Well, I'm just sitting here well, we can, in order to prevent drive-offs, we, manually survey vehicles because we don't have a security screen like at, what's it called? The one, Holiday has security screens right there in the register area. We don't have that at the registers, so we're doing it with a Mark 1 eyeball. And with 2-3 people, we can look at maybe 3 cars, and that's most of the front row, with the back row being completely invisible. But, yeah, long story short, middle management doesn't fucking know what the hell the rest of the workforce is doing.
So, to kind of go back to the definition of labor, the biggest thing that the post-work movement is kind of against is this whole productive labor. Not necessarily in terms of creating things that are necessary, but creating things that aren't necessarily needed, but people buy anyways. We're talking the luxury items for the most part that the bourgeois and the rich kind of buy. The really extravagant dresses, the really extravagant foods, the things that aren't necessarily there to better people's lives in a meaningful way, but kind of cover up the fact that their lives are meaningless and filled with dread.
There is that, but there's also like actual scientific evidence that humans do benefit mentally from the presence of beauty.
Well, but we're not talking about getting rid of art per se, right? We're not talking getting rid of beautiful things, but more like getting rid of useless things. Say, for example, the automobile is considered a very useless thing because we're generating a lot of this extra work to build roads where we could just build our communities more tightly knit and more close together. And not only would we lessen our ecological impact, but we would also have entire systems that would be necessarily abolished with the abolition of, long drive times.
Yeah, it does definitely impose a bunch of costs on people who have to commute to work.
I feel like the automobile might be slightly indispensable in modern society or contemporary society.
It's not about the era, it's more about the way that history panned out and the way that things were built out. Like, we were way overinvested in, like, a highway system and way underinvested in rail, at least in the U.S.
That's true. Yeah, without the ability to travel long distance and having to build our communities closer together, we'd probably end up with a greater ecological impact as we fill the void between cities with more cities. Suddenly, Vivisector gets to turn all the national forests into a parking garage. That's from Furry Force!
Well, and that's actually a thing, I can't believe I'm actually going to reference this, but that song, turned paradise into a parking lot. It's kind of that same idea. And basically getting rid of, natural beauty for things that aren't necessarily necessary.
Whoa, that was a fucking mouthful, alright.
It's recursive, too.
Yeah. But is deemed as necessary because of the way that we have structured our current society. Like, if we had ended up structuring our current society in a manner where communities were more tight-knit and we had rail systems or public buses going to and from the communities, then not everybody would be owning a car. We wouldn't have these sprawling campuses of parking lots alone.
Bikes would be fucking popular. And I'm thinking of, like, the bike equivalent to a parking garage or a parking lot, and you can fit so many fucking bikes.
They actually have those in a lot of the larger cities in Europe, where you basically, I don't even know if you necessarily had to pay a fee, because I can't really remember. I think some did, but most of them didn't, where you lock your bike in and you go on your way into the community.
I'm just like imagining the dude where's my car situation, not the movie, but the walking into a parking garage. But with the density of, like, because you've seen how close people can lock their bikes up together. So, like, with that density, and I can't find my fucking bike. Cheers.
Yeah, you're taking, a complex that would take, 3 or 4 acres of land and squishing it down into, 400 or 500 square feet.
No, I mean, there's the issue of passengers. Not everybody can ride, etc., but we can have trikes with the thing. Or, and hell, motorized bikes, I've been informed those are called motorcycles, can also supplant the cars quite nicely. But I do think the car climbs above them in terms of safety, but that's also usually assuming the presence of other cars.
Mm-hmm. So we kind of went off on a tangent here, so let's bring it back to this post-work theory, which... The biggest thing that they're discussing in post-work theory is 3 big pillars. Automation, lowering the necessary hours of work a week, and opening up leisure time by bringing down those hours. Kind of like unions have been doing for decades.
So you're talking about fully automated luxury gay space communism.
It's more of like the transition to fully automated luxury gay-space communism.
Mostly automated luxury gay-space communism.
Yeah, because because kind of like how we were mentioning in in the definition of work, they don't necessarily want to get rid of labor, right? They just want to get rid of the unnecessary work, the 60 hours a week jobs that, all you're doing is just plugging numbers into a computer to make capitalists look good, right?
Right.
Because in a system where profit is maximized, what's the point in, having spreadsheets of numbers that are telling you how much profit you're making?
Would that necessarily eliminate sports ball labor, or would we probably still have that?
Well, that's definitely playful labor.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I consider it playful labor.
I didn't finish the whole article, so...
Ah.
I thought that was a thing to bring up, because, again, society might not be too pleased at the potential loss of an NBA.
I mean, I've always been kind of wondering, like, why professional sports is so popular when these are very accessible sports for most people to play.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not working so hard that you don't even want to expend the effort to play basketball, you just want to play basketball and actually enjoy it instead, at least more than you would otherwise if you're being overworked.
Well, I don't quite understand spectator sports either.
I think a good analog would be, you see a lot of people complaining about children watching other children play with toys, and people are like, "Oh, why are you watching speedruns or other people play video games? Why don't you just play the video game?" And one of the biggest things that is brought up to me that I've heard is that a lot of these kids their parents can't afford those toys, so they have to watch other kids play with them. Or in the case of video games, you're watching people perform at a level that you can't necessarily perform at because they've been doing it their entire lives, because they've had the time and they've had the resources, or at least for speedruns, or in the case of a lot of really expensive games, you're watching people play these games because you want to experience the game as a medium that brings a story across, but you don't necessarily have the funds or the time to invest in it yourself.
Sure, I'm not saying there's no reason for it, but it just seems like most of the people who are interested in professional sports have the means available to just play those sports.
And here's the big thing:
That's true.
it's also a motivational thing with some people. Like they can, it can motivate them to do these things and try to get to that level, whether or not they actually can.
But that's still a small fraction of the people who are interested in professional sports who just don't play them on their own.
It makes, I guess, the hopeless situation that is our lives a little more seem a little less hopeless.
And I think in a post-work world, you wouldn't have as much of that, and there wouldn't be as I'm sure there might still be some semblance of pro sports, but I don't think it would look anything like it does today, where you're just hiring a bunch of people to work to maintain the stadium so that you can get thousands of people in to watch one game.
It wouldn't be a multi-billion-dollar industry where people are literally throwing money at the system just to kind of see if it can keep going.
Yeah.
So I do kind of want to talk about, the David Frayne talks about the colonizing power of work and how, work the useless labor is necessarily trying to colonize the leisure time of people. Instead of having people raise wages, you find work for them to do. You make up bullshit jobs so people have to continue working.
If you got time to lean, you've got time to clean.
Mm-hmm. That's the biggest thing you hear in retail and in food service.
Well, food service, it makes sense, because if you're not... I've seen what it looks like when people decide they don't have time to clean, and I guarantee you, I will always get some shit cleaned if I'm serving food to people. I don't want people. But retail, it makes absolutely no sense. It's just keeping your workers busy so you can get as much out of them as physically possible. And
getting as much of them as physically possible brings us to lean staffing. This capitalist idea of not necessarily understaffing a job, but staffing so close to understaffing that, let's say one person calls out sick, then everybody involved has to pick up that slack. And I mean, that seems to be like kind of a duh idea, you know. Well, if someone's not there, then obviously the other people need to pick up the job. But in lean staffing, it's so bad that you're already giving everybody exactly 8 hours of work to perform in exactly 8 hours. So when that one person calls out sick, or has a family emergency, or just doesn't want to go into work that day, I mean, there's nothing wrong against that. You have that 8 hours of that person divvied out to the other people who are already working exactly 8 hours of work. Between that and having people having to come in because of that situation, then you're capturing this leisure time that the capitalists think that they're bestowing upon other people, upon their employees.
Just think about it. Like, in terms of the whole, between both of these factors, lean staffing and the if you got time to lean mentality, it does help point to the issue where, you have to excuse my words being bad because I'm high, how much of the value of your labor your boss is getting out of you if they're trying to squeeze every last penny. Is like, okay, you know how much you're getting paid, you know you ain't getting paid enough for this shit, so how much is the boss saving money by working me as hard as I am? And then you can kind of get an idea of how, basically how much underpaid you get.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of this idea of post-work theory. When you lessen the hours of work, you kind of have to necessarily increase the pay, because it doesn't make sense if you drop someone who has to work 60 hours a week to make their ends meet down to 20 hours and be like, oh, look at all the leisure time you have, and then now they can't eat.
Well, I feel like that might be a unique situation to the right now because of our because of our laws on wages and full-time versus part-time. It actually costs less for an employer to have 2 part-time laborers for every full-time laborer they would have otherwise. So they do that, and they keep it. Like, again, we're going back to SA, which is now Speedway, but, just gonna throw mad shade. They will actually write you up if you get too many hours. Like, it's a write-up.
Yeah, because under the current system, if you are considered a full-time employee, the company has to offer you benefits, has to offer you PTO, healthcare.
Well, and also,
like
the pay rate's different. Like, you earn less. You don't earn less per hour. You get paid less per hour if you're part-time.
You cost less to them.
Yeah, you cost less at part-time, so they just double their workforce and drop their pay by like 25% or something, depending.
I think it is kind of one of the limiting aspects of the way that labor reform has happened here, that it has this very productivist mindset of you only get these benefits if you work in this particular way, and they're like trying to prescribe exactly the way that you're supposed to do work. And when you do that and add extra burdens onto that to try to improve the condition of those workers, the capitalists don't care. They'll just like, okay, well, the line is 40 hours, so we'll move you back to 39. Or the line is 32 hours, so we'll move you back to 31. They just don't care. They'll just work around it. They don't care about your, like, whatever norms of what work is supposed to be. They just care about getting the productivity out of people.
And it's kind of, it's kind of one of the biggest things that unions need to pivot from, is this conceptualization of productive hours versus work hours. Like, a lot of unions are arguing, well, full-time workers can do this, but part-time, because they're trying to compromise. But you can't really be compromising with someone who wants to, extract as much labor for as little money as possible. So laborers need to kind of pivot away from, well, we want the minimum wage to be this, to more of like, well, we need to have our wages tied directly to the productivity and profit margins of the company itself. And every worker needs to be offered benefits, not just full-time workers. So that way, the capitalist has to make a decision whether either they go full automation and people revolt because they're out of all these jobs and they don't have a way to eat, or they stop doing lean staffing, or they stop doing, trying to capture that very specific small amount of unproductive hours that you're at work, right?
I think it's relevant to the bread book that Kropotkin talks about things like that, where it's in the 5th chapter, I believe, about food. Let me just bring my notes up real quick.
Can we address the fact that we are, in fact, calling it the bread book?
What's wrong with that?
It's always been called the bread book.
It's totally the bread book.
Oh, okay.
It's always been called the bread book. Like, that's not something that we invented. Like, people on the left have been calling it the bread book probably since it's been written. At least since I've heard about it, it's been called the bread book. But yeah, Kropotkin, this is very important to Kropotkin, this idea of, not necessarily trying to capture the most amount of labor hours while you're at work, but creating productive work that is actually productive as opposed to pseudo-productive.
I read this, but I didn't actually have notes on it. But it was, while he was discussing, like, the alternatives of, like, national workshops and stuff like that, basically, I think it was actually about the collectivists. He wanted to, in rejecting collectivism, he was rejecting the idea that the rewards of labor should be tied specifically to labor. And
yeah,
that's basically part of the anti-productivist attitude is just, no, you don't have to necessarily be productive or be a member of this particular group or be a complex laborer or anything like that in order to actually be justified in getting those benefits of it.
And that's kind of why a lot of post-work theorists kind of do argue for something known as Universal Basic Income, UBI. I'm sure a lot of our listeners probably know what UBI is, but just kind of give a brief recap. It's this idea that the government, or some centralized force, extracts a tax from the profit margins of these corporations and then redivvies it back out to the workers in mass, saying, hey, you're going to get paid X amount of dollars every month, regardless of whether you work or not. And a lot of people kind of are either for or against it or even ambivalent to it, because there are so many nuanced positions regarding UBI. Like, for example, I'm necessarily against it because of the fact that it is merely a band-aid, a mitigation technique to help propel capitalism forward from its dying lurches,
and
right?
I'm kind of for it because it eliminates the possibility of an employer manufacturing consent.
And I'm kind of ambivalent on it because I think that both of those points are right, but it really depends on what your priorities are, what you think is the bigger threat. Is it just immediately being having consent effectively manufactured like that, or is it that, like, in the long term, this system is going to perpetuate itself indefinitely by compensating for the inequalities that it naturally produces without actually fundamentally changing anything underneath that?
When it comes down to it, UBI is ultimately something that it does untie people's livelihoods, people's ability to live, to their productive workforce, right? So if you're receiving a UBI, if you're working in a job that you absolutely hate, you can more easily just be like, okay, I'm done, and leave, and not have to worry about, oh my gosh, where's my next meal come from? How am I going to pay rent?
And that's that good shit, because then employers have to treat you as though you actually have the option of leaving. Like, if you treat me bad, I'm out.
Yeah, and I also think that that's kind of, in a sense, anti-socialist and anti-union, mostly because, like, if you're mitigating, the capitalist effects, you're making it more individualist, not necessarily egoist in the sense of individualism, but more egotistical, where the worker is more worried about what is happening to them as opposed to their co-workers. So if you have a UBI, unions kind of drop off the face of the map because, well, I don't need a union to fight for better pay and, better benefits because I'll just go somewhere else and find it there.
I mean, I get that, and it makes a whole lot of sense. But here's the thing that I would say that this is a good thing. Because unions are great, but if UBI is so great as to, I don't know, I think it's a point in UBI's favor if people are choosing it over unions, because if that's the case, then we may have found something that's actually more effective than that.
But you're still giving the control of the workspaces over to the capitalists, right?
It preserves the unjust system while just fixing the imbalances that injustice creates.
Actually, that might have a different effect, because I'm thinking about it, is like if everybody at a given job has the option, under UBI, whether or not they'll just fucking leave it. And if the boss is, a total douche canoe, it's not going to be just one person that leaves and the other people just stay there because it's not their problem. Everybody who can't tolerate the guy will stop working for him and his business will tank.
It does make striking more easy, yeah.
So, I mean, it makes striking fast,
almost
deadly, and permanent.
Yeah, it almost becomes the default, whereas without a UBI, without a union, at least union mitigating the cost of striking, then you can't necessarily strike as a first resort. It becomes a last resort because then you have to worry about, I'm not going to get paid while I'm striking. Whereas with the UBI
you need to eat. You need your bread.
Yeah. Whereas with a UBI, or at least union-funded strikes, it becomes a lot easier to be like, well, I don't need to work anyways, so if I don't like where I'm working, or I don't like the situation I'm working in, I can just be like, okay, I'm done, bye. But I like my job, I just don't like the conditions.
Yeah. Under UBI, someone, it's bad to get a job, you can just not come in the next day. Maybe even see who else has decided, fuck this. Let the phone ring.
And I do think that the UBI does push for this post-work idea, because if your ends are already met, right? If your housing is paid for, if your food is paid for, if your medical is paid for, then you don't have to work dead-end jobs. You don't have to work useless labor jobs, because you just need to have an income. You have your income. Now you can focus on what you actually care about. You can actually make a difference in the field that you want to go into, right?
And now, someone may say, but under UBI, nobody would work because they'd all have what they need, and so it'd stop our productive forces, to which I'd say, maybe. Or maybe they'd, choose to work because they can live on something more than just basic income.
Well, Kropotkin goes over something like this in the book also, when he's talking about like the Russian peasant who works 16 hours to get 9 months worth of food for a year. Once you lift that burden off them and they realize that they don't have to, they no longer have to pay for everybody that's stealing from them, they won't have any reason to work so hard as to make more than they themselves need. And that would mean less of the peasant crop going into the cities where there's hungry people that need it. Kropotkin recognizes that this is a possibility in a situation that is even more extreme than UBI. So it's not like it's an unrealistic or like new idea that people might work less if you give them free stuff, or at least lift burdens off of them that have been artificially imposed.
Well, I mean, we built a society without those costs, or without those burdens imposed on humanity. I think we can still go upwards without them.
And before nature's oppressive arguments.
I guess.
Yeah, because there's this big kind of, one of the biggest arguments against the anti-work movement is people are arguing because the post-work argument is necessarily, hey, I shouldn't have to work to survive, kind of an anti-capitalist thing, right? Well, the argument against it is, well, you have to forage for food and hunt for food without civilization. So I guess you think nature's oppressive too. And it's like that's not necessarily what is being said. It's in nature, yeah, you're going to have to work to eat, but we're discussing solely in post-work the useless labor.
I'm just saying
the bloat, bureaucracy.
We're not just discussing the useless labor, because it's not about labor, it's about work.
And also, who fucking brought up labor? Come on now.
Yeah. And even Kropotkin even talks about the bloat of bureaucracies actually effectively killing revolutions.
Many times.
Because
a lot. He goes at
examples.
length about it.
Because he goes on about how, when it comes down to, in a revolution, how do you distribute the food? A bureaucracy would sit there and waste months and months to be like, well, what do we think is the right thing? And they'll compile lists and they'll compile...
They'll write reports for so long that the revolution dies.
Or literally and metaphysically. And post-work kind of moves towards this in the sense that, well, if we get rid of this excessive bloat and we refuse to do the bureaucratic things, just like Kropotkin said, if we just go to the people and ask what they need, we can more easily provide for them than creating a committee that's so far removed that they don't even know what's going on and what is needed.
Yeah, it's like I said with the thing about hierarchies and the corruption of information flowing through them and the corruption of commands coming down through them. That the bureaucracies are subject to that every bit as much as private corporations are.
So to kind of, I guess we're kind of wrapping up here because we kind of went over most of how what post-work is and how it affects the movement towards anarchist communism.
Already at the end of this? Holy shit.
We're at like 42 minutes.
Damn.
I mean, do you have another couple topics to kind of discuss? Because this wasn't really like a detailed...
I don't know. I mean, a lot of these things just tend to do that. They kind of spiral in on each other, and there's always more to be said. And the time kind of flew. I don't have a good sense of time right now.
Yeah, this topic lends itself to tangents also, as I'm sure we experienced today.
I mean, I guess the biggest thing that I do want to bring up before we discuss is the rising of wages in a post-work system. Because if you're working less hours, you need a way to kind of keep the costs up. Even with the UBI, you still need to find a way to make people be paid more for their labor, because nobody's going to be working for 25 cents an hour. That people just look at you and laugh. Be like, well, what's that going to buy me a pack of gum?
They'll buy you jawbreakers, Eddie.
Yeah, right?
God, these kids had like the hardest time putting together 25 cents.
It's because they were kids, what do you expect? They thought 25 cents was the world. That's all they needed, was a jawbreaker. And can you imagine if that was how our post-work system was? Everything else is paid for, but you want a jawbreaker, you gotta work hard for it, man. You gotta work 16 hours a day just to get that 25 cents. You don't even know if you're gonna get it. No, gross.
I feel like that's what labor is if you organize your shit, or that's what a job is if you do your job planning while high as shit.
You don't get anything done, so you ultimately just kind of putter out.
Like, you work hard, but you're doing nothing. And it's not because of any policies, it's because you planned, because you thought you were going to sort out what you're going to do in an altered state.
Oh, I do want to discuss, before we kind of wrap everything up, the Protestant work ethic. I don't think we actually discussed it. The idea that your life doesn't really have value unless you are producing something.
Ah, yes.
Spooky.
Yeah.
Wait, what did you call it?
And that's kind of another thing that the post-work theory is against, because in our current system, we have this, metaphysical stigma against people just lying about. Like, you even mentioned it earlier, Cardin. People are like, well, if we just pay them a UBI, then they're not going to want to work. Well, what's wrong with not wanting to work? There's not necessarily a bad thing when it comes to working. not working, right?
I mean, there's a slight problem of eventually someone has to do something in order to make something happen. So there's jobs that need to be done, but the thing is, a lot of these jobs anyone could do.
Well, and that kind of lends itself to the question against the anarchist perspective, which we have all heard, who's going to build the roads? If you don't have a state, who's going to build the roads? And it's like, well, necessarily somebody will, because they're going to need it, and they're like, oh, well, this is a good idea. Like, even in the capitalist system, nobody sat down and was like, I'm going to invent the cell phone, because I'm being paid to do that. No, people were sitting around and being like, hey, you know, it'd be really fucking cool if you could contact...
If I could call someone from my fucking pocket.
Yeah, that'd be super fucking cool. Oh, and what if we could play music from it?
Whoa,
Oh my God,
music
awesome.
anywhere?
Anywhere. But yeah.
Of your... So maybe like a big sound system that you carry over your shoulder, right?
No, we're talking like a small rectangle that fits in your pocket.
A small... But you gotta hook it up to like big powerful speakers so you can play it, right?
No, the speakers are in the phone. But yeah,
Whoa.
like...
Okay, I went too far.
You don't
that,
have...
sorry.
you don't have people that just sit around and do nothing all day. I mean, yeah, you'll have like a small amount of people, but people like to feel productive. Like,
if nothing else, it gives them something to do in the day.
Yeah, I mean, people don't want to just laze about all day. I mean, yeah, there are some, but the majority of people aren't going to want to laze about all day. So even if, you know...
And also, if we accept the existence of markets in socialism or communism, which markets will happen, then the incentive to work suddenly becomes, well, I can live on this basic income and it will keep me afloat. But I could get a little extra. Like, if we have markets, then we have incentive just because people can... They know they won't fall through the fucking bottom, but they know they can also raise themselves up a little.
Yeah, I think ultimately self-actualization motivation is going to be enough to get people to continue to do productive things or expand their ability to get the things that they want. It's not like we just want idleness all the time. I mean, when you work for 40 hours or 60 hours because you have two jobs and they're both part-time, then yeah, you want all the relaxation time you can get. But like, if you don't need to and you just want to pursue, because like, I want to try growing a garden. Okay, you can just go and do that and learn how to do it, and you'll be producing food in the process, or flowers or something.
And I just want the assurance that, you know, my boss won't be an abusive asshole. And if I have the option of walking right out whenever I feel like it, he can't do that. Or she.
Now, I also want to highlight the kind of the negatives of post-work theory, at least in terms of the automation side. Because if you don't necessarily get rid of the current oppressive system, the automation will become useless even with the UBI. Because if jobs drop from, you know, let's say 95% of the populace to 40% of the populace because we push for automation and we push for this UBI, then yeah, you will have people that still are trying to self-actualize, but you're not necessarily sure that self-actualization will generate any kind of materialist ends, right? Like, you could sit there and grow that garden, but if all you're doing is growing flowers, then yeah, that's great, but you're not necessarily going to... I don't know, I guess the more I'm thinking about it, the more I'm like, well, I guess there isn't really a bad thing against post-work theory.
I mean, the only thing there is that it's not as productive, and oh no, it's not as productive. I mean, people who need things will figure out ways to arrange to have them produced if they're not excluded by, like, property law from using the tools that they need. I mean, it's a self-regulating system in that regard. You don't have to, like, put artificial impositions on it to get people to do productive things. You don't need to have some, like, Protestant work ethic where it's just normatively a good thing to be productive for productivity's sake. You just don't need that because productivity serves the ends that it serves as well as it's going to.
We've gotten past that point in our society today. Like, as a species, we're not in the savage past anymore.
No. And we've also reached a point where productivity has been increasing, but we're also reaching a plateau where productivity can only increase so much, where you might as well move to automation, because anything past our current productivity rates will be effectively automation.
I don't know about that, because there's a lot of things that we can do that, like, they take a person doing them, that we aren't doing because we can't sell them, that are still productive and valuable and that people would like to have. I mean, like, I've been annoyed that I don't own the place that I live. I never have. But there's so many things I would like to improve about the houses that I've been living in or the apartments I've been living in that I can't because it's not even mine. And that would take work to do. And even if I'm, like, in between doing productive work that directly helps other people, there's things that I want to do that are productive and make value for whatever building I'm in.
Yeah, people like beauty.
Yeah, beauty and functionality. I mean,
and
modern buildings are so bland.
So I get.
I'm kind of making a living doing the commission work, so people definitely.
Brutalism when?
What?
Talking about how what Zulikath said about having everything just kind of being bland. I said brutalism when?
People don't like brutalism in their architecture, but they'll take it in their products.
Oh yeah, definitely. So let's just kind of wrap up since we're closing in on that hour here. Post-work theory is kind of. I want to say it was informed by the Bread Book at the very least, if not directly, then at least indirectly, because we do see a lot of parallels in what Kropotkin is going to be talking about in the next couple of chapters that we're going to cover, in terms of food, shelter, and clothing, and how we need to stop worrying about being productive for productivity's sake, but rather be productive because we want to be, or because
it serves our needs.
We have needs that need to be filled.
Yep.
You guys didn't have any closing thoughts before we go ahead and close out this episode?
Just that I noticed that post-work and post-left tend to go together remarkably well. It seems like some of the popular post-work people are post-left, and they're also very close to egoism. They apply that quite a bit, and it just seems like a lot of the post-work theory is based around rejecting the norm of productivity as a spook. And just recognizing that this isn't a thing that we need for its own sake, and it's just to serve our actual ends. And when you apply that, post-work becomes pretty much obvious.
It's really weird because the productivity for productivity's sake kind of reminds me of sort of Manifest Destiny, actually, that sort of expand or die mentality.
Alright, well, I have to get going, guys. Today has been great.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
I think this is a good little one-off that we can do. Thank you so much for joining me. Please like us, subscribe, and donate to our Patreon if we ever get any of that stuff set up.
Yeah, do any of those things.
Alright, thank you so much.
house and put up a parking lot.